Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Jay Jennings. I'm a former chair of what used to be called the Arkansas Literary Festival and is now the Six Bridges Book Festival. And this is a wonderful event for the city, and especially for us people who toil the other 50 weeks of the year in silence, and can finally come up and bring our friends in to speak to you and show off their work. I would like to thank, first of all, the Cowles Foundation, which is sponsoring this particular session. And please support the sponsors who support this festival overall. It's really wonderful, and we're looking forward for it to continue long into the future. I want to introduce our two guests here for this panel, which has the unacknowledged title of Inspired by Portis, which is one reason I'm here, since I recently edited the Library of America's Charles Portis collected works, and these two writers happen to be fans of our native son. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I also want you to, you'll encounter their own work, which is just wonderful in its own right. I first encountered Elizabeth McKenzie's work when I picked up her novel from 2016, The Portable Veblen. I'd read in the New York Times review by my friend and former festival presenter Jennifer Senior, and she identified McKenzie's high notes as hearing musical potential in language that others do not, in the manufactured jargon of economics, in the Latin taxonomy of the animal kingdom, dialogue that has real fizz, and an angled way of seeing things. My kind of book. I read it, loved it, and regularly recommended it as one of my favorite books of that year, then of the past couple of years, then of the past half-decade. It kept making my all-time favorites list as the years passed. In the time since it was published, I got married, my wife and I had a daughter, and it became one of her favorite books too. At age 3, she kept pulling it off the bookshelf because it had a squirrel on the cover. We both eagerly awaited her next book, and when I heard about its title, The Dog of the North, I was kind of shocked at its clear nod to the title of the Charles Portis novel, The Dog of the South. As someone steeped in Portis's work, I thought it almost an affront. Once I dived in, however, and was immersed in the world and voice of Penny Lane as she narrates a wild intercontinental adventure, I was once again reminded of the great and unique pleasures of reading Elizabeth's work, and I'm now happy to have a new McKenzie novel to add to my list of favorites. The crackle and pop of language and the deployment of an unforgettable narrative voice is also among Glenn Taylor's literary gifts, and I've enjoyed his work since the publication of his first novel, The Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2009. I later had the pleasure of editing him at the Oxford American. With Glenn, the term editing is used loosely, as his prose is so rambunctious and singular that it's best just to leave it alone. You often won't know where Betty Baache's stories are going, and I mean that in the best way. Her life and songs and dreams are so surprising, starting with her age, she's 321 years old, and so compelling that you ride with her in a plane, on the waters of a flood, into the past, present, and future, wherever she goes. Elizabeth's novels are steeped in California culture, and Glenn's draw deeply on his West Virginia roots. But like the Arklatex characters that Charles Portis created, however much Penny Lane and Betty Baache embody their geographic origins, their struggles and trials are universal. Both writers have acknowledged a debt to the Arkansas master, and Glenn will even be returning to Arkansas in November to make a presentation at the Portis Symposium held at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith. We'll talk a little bit about what Portis means to these two writers, but know that however much they may revere Portis, these two are sublime artists in their own right, as you will hear shortly. So join me in welcoming them to Little Rock and the Six Bridges Book Festival. So we'll first hear Elizabeth. You want to start us off with a reading?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Jay, for that really nice introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thanks to the festival for inviting us and providing this really nice place to meet. I'm just going to read a short scene very near the beginning of the book. Basically, the situation is that Penny, the main character, has just left a bad marriage. She's about to enter a series of misadventures, and she's been picked up in Santa Barbara. She's gone from Santa Cruz to Santa Barbara to help her divorced grandparents. They each have different problems, but her grandmother's accountant has been in touch with her and trying to get her involved in helping deal with the grandmother. And he's picked her up that day at the train station and taken her out to dinner. Excuse me. Now the pitcher came, along with our glasses rimmed with salt. Bert poured, and soon we were clinking the glasses together and sang cheers with the camaraderie of soldiers on the eve of battle. The margarita was great. I was glad Bert had recognized the necessity of it. He'd also ordered nachos and guacamole as a starter, and we were digging into both with gusto. Under the influence, Bert began to rhapsodize about my grandmother. She's a great lady, whatever you say at the end of the day, he said. A great lady. I've learned a lot from her. She's one of the world's great people, he said to my surprise. What do you like about her? The woman's an original thinker. She has her own opinions. She doesn't suffer fools. She's not afraid to speak her mind. And she's as strong as an ox, let me tell you. You should see her jump into the dog. This demanded clarification. My van, Dog of the North, all I got at the end of the marriage. Really? That's all you got? What can I say? The woman's greedy. When she was greedy for me, I liked it. How old are you, Bert? I asked, disinhibited by the delicious drink. Guess. 65? Hey, ouch, I'm 57. Shit. Sorry, I'm really bad at ages, I apologized. Even with this head of hair, which is a toupee, by the way, a very expensive one. I hadn't suspected, though it was true, his hair was unusually dense and mink-like. You're lucky you're meeting me this month, he said. Next month you'd tell me I look 90. What happens next month? My brother gets it. We switch off. Was he telling me he and his brother shared a hairpiece? How could that be? I hated it when I wasn't sure what someone was saying and always took it to be my fault, an auditory processing problem. So I said, cool, hoping that was the right response. But isn't it inconvenient when you don't have it? Of course it is, but there are such things as hats. Well, there sure are, I said, still not sure I understood him correctly. How about you? How old are you? I'm going to guess 30, Bert said. I shrugged. You're very gallant, 35. Oh, great age. Boy, how things change. When we were married, Jenny and I used to drive up north in the dog and spend a few weeks every summer in Washington and British Columbia. We were planning to retire in Washington State on one of those islands in the San Juans. All my life, I thought how great it would be to have a few feet of beachfront and a kayak, throw in a Panama hat and a cocktail, and we'd be set. Well, you know, I thought about it so much, sometimes I feel like I really did have it. I asked why he called it the Dog of the North. He said his ex had named it in honor of a beloved novel with a similar name. Literary references aside, he said, the name combined two of his favorites, trips north and dogs. Soon we were served hot plates smothered with enchiladas, rice, beans. Bert ate lustily. It was sad to ponder his shattered dreams for his marriage and future, especially since I had so many of those myself. Have another, Bert said, refilling my salted glass. So enough about me. Your grandmother tells me you're separating from her husband and she's very disappointed. I know, I said Sherman was always very nice to her, but she doesn't know what he's really like. How could she know? We discover things about our spouses that nobody else ever will. Marriage is one long striptease of the soul. Right, I said, taking a large gulp of my drink. Exactly, that is so true. It'll be a cold day in hell before I marry again, Bert said. I would think twice for sure, I said. We clinked glasses again. You know what I found out about my wife, Bert said, gulping down some beans? What? That she couldn't stand having sex with me. She announced that when we went to a marriage counselor. It was the first I'd heard about it. I can see how that would wreck things, I said. I had plenty of girlfriends before I met her. They didn't seem to mind. I couldn't fail to notice the erotic undertone of the comment. I was completely unable to say anything in return, and Bert, like a male bird who had successfully flashed his plumage, sat back and radiated some form of conquest simply for having crowed about himself. But whether or not that conquest was of me or the memory of the plenty of girlfriends who didn't mind him, it was impossible to determine. Bert's physical appearance was reasonably attractive. He had broad shoulders, large features. He would look better bald than bewigged, I thought. He appeared to be clean. His hands were large, his fingernails trimmed. Reluctantly, I imagined what it would be like to come over to his side of the table and make out with him in the booth, which in turn led me to wonder exactly how elastic my desires had or should become. So what went wrong with yours, he was asking. Not my favorite topic, but the margarita was making me relaxed and insouciant. Well, disturbing memories flashed through my mind, and I started laughing in reverse proportion to any humor in it. Ha 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 ha. Then my stomach clenched, and tears popped from the corners of my eyes. Bert leaned in closer. Sorry, I said, taking the kind of long, slow breath I'd been taught for moments like these. I stammered through a brief outline of the past few years, Sherman's gradual disillusionment with academia while working on his PhD, his abrupt purchase of a mobile knife-sharpening business, the growing frequency of his nights away from home before I caught on. And it all got worse after my parents disappeared. Like, instead of trying to help me through it, he was mad. Wicked, Bert said. Human psychology is nuts. I'll stop there.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. Elizabeth and I just discovered each other's work through these books, and I think are both anxious to read others, but you gotta get that just to see what happens after they leave dinner and they're walking. I wish you had gotten to that part because it is hilarious. I just, real briefly just want to say thank you to Cal's, I'm enamored. I got to go to, it's my first time to Little Rock, first of all, and I got to spend all day at Central High yesterday with the students in the library, and it was just, got to go to the museum, so I'm feeling very high on our heroes, the librarians, especially at this time, as we all know, when we're a bit under attack in places like West Virginia and Arkansas. So I don't want to go on and on up here, but I just wanted to acknowledge that. It's been truly a great experience, so can't wait to come back. As Jay, and I really want to thank Jay too. This is actually the first time we've met in person, though we've been communicating for quite some time, and I'm just honored to be here. As Jay said, this is a 321-year-old narrator. My first 3 novels are nothing like this. I wrote this one during COVID, during some very strange, isolated times, and so none of my other books have been from like a first-person teller. They've all been kind of these big omniscient voices, and I was very hesitant to try and write from Betty Baaches' point of view, but I couldn't escape it. And so I just need to say briefly that whenever I read from this book, it's always strange because I have to tell the audience, please don't think it's me up here reading. Please picture me and hear me as an old lady. Because really this voice comes from an amalgamation of my grandma Lena, who's no longer with us, my Aunt Linda, who's no longer with us, Dot Jackson, who was a writer from South Carolina who I loved, who's no longer with us, and then Really the voice of two dead poets who I was reading voraciously while writing this book. One is Louise McNeil, a West Virginia poet, and the other is Lucille Clifton, who's always with me in all of my work. And so I just have to shout out all of them and thank them for giving me this voice that I pretty much just kind of channeled onto the page. I've never read the opening chapter before, and I'm going to do it today. Hopefully that'll provide a little bit more context and maybe get you interested in the book. One last thing I should say is that Betty is telling this from the year 2038 and looking back on all of her life, and it's non-chronological. So something else I've never even considered is, writing a book from the unknown future. Things have not gone well, to say the least. So this is called Song of the Mule Bird. Each chapter is Song of something. This is Song of the Mule Bird. Bend me your ear, and I'll tell you a story about everything. There are songs you might remember and places you can see, trees and street corners and airplanes and old vehicles and creeks and roads with hairpin turns. Remember the dawn chorus through the window? The littlest bird sang loudest from the deep bosom. The worm-eating warbler trilled like a bug, and the song sparrow sang, "Boy, oh boy, put on the kettle." No one truthfully knows how many birds remain. Estimates on extinction rates vary, and I've got no ornithologist to query. But if you step outside and conduct your own study, I bet the hush in the trees will ring your ears. The hills are alive with the sound of truant birds, and the field is quiet as a shell. Out in the deep woods, over the course of an hour, you're liable to hear 2 or 3 bird songs, seldom more. They congregate on high and conversate. I've seen them plain as day through Remy's binoculars. I saw a woodpecker, 2 goldfinches, a titmouse. I've seen more little birds since the arrow. I'll tell you about the arrow another time. There was an old expression uttered on occasions of escape. The bird has flown. I tell my grandbabies that the birds have flown to the sun, called there by a radial core of love, and when they ask me, "Won't the birds burn alive, Big Mom?" I say, "Yes, that's right, children, and only then will the unknown gods convene their barbecue, licking their greasy fingers and picking their teeth with a snapped muskrat dick bone, raising their goblets to toast our true birth, our beginning anew." One of my most cherished pastimes is saying such things when a child asks about a bird or a muskrat or a plane or a car. I won't speak aloud that grease-licking dick bone part to my grandbabies, of course. Or if I did, I would say muskrat baculum. If a child spots a worm-eating warbler around these parts, that child is said to be lucky. This luck lasts for some undefined short burst of time, determined by the children, and during which they all long to be near the lucky one. Luckier still is the child who spots an airplane, but it does happen. Once every couple months, an old wild-hair aviator out of Mosestown gets a prop turning on Heuchel and sputters over a ridge and out of sight, and the children run with their eyes on the sky, making sounds they didn't know they could. Then they sit in a circle and argue endlessly about whether every steel drum of jet fuel got burned up or not. I tell them, "Children, don't miss the forest for the trees. There's no need for fuel when your compass is a magnet." It's been 9 years since the last of the big burns and buybacks, and domestic planes were grounded by then anyway. Avionics satellites floating dead, radio towers taken out quick as they were built. The children need to know what broke in order to build a better way. Until then, it is what it is, and you ain't getting off the ground in no iron bird, no matter how many times your pilot taps the glass. There are traveling tailpackers who stop at the trading post every now and again, and they all spin the story of the bygone pilot. A couple of them call it Aviator No More. These are buskined affairs with theatrical face contortions and 2 props, headphones and aviator sunglasses. There's always a whole lot of pleading hand gestures reminiscent of a Punch and Judy show. It's the tale of old men and women who seek out the airplane graveyard and climb their stepladder and mount the cockpit, and there they sit and deliver a monologue, tapping those little invisible glass circles for hours, waiting for the needle to jump. It never jumps. That's the money line every time. It never jumps. They remove their sunglasses and wipe at trained tears. "I want to fly again," they plead. "Please, God, let me fly again." The tailpackers are spinning memories of movies. It's a tired affair. Hiuchel is what the real aviators in Mosestown call their homemade fuel. It's hooch fuel. I knew an old woman who sipped it one time. I was fond of the float plane, for I once grew fat and rich and traveled to islands by float plane, and on these islands I slept in white hotels with blue dome roofs, where guest books were filled with complaints of former guests. They wrote, "Why must the insects be so loud? Something must be done about the incessant call of the insects and the birds who are relentless." And so something was done. The hotels had consolidated their management, and a decision was made to spray pesticides and leave upon windowsills crumbs of poisoned bread. And do you know that it worked? The islands grew silent, except for the buzz of the mopeds. No matter, for the children of the wealthy traveler had grown weary of being outdoors. There was too much that was soiled and infectious. There were startling sights and sounds that might damage the sensitive children. The outdoors were so different from the call of their tablets to which they had become accustomed. Once, in the belly of a Cessna, I broke a tablet over my knee, but that is a story for another time. My littlest grandbabies weren't yet born in the time of the wealthy traveler who complained in the hotel guest book. They hear of it from the older children, and they can't imagine such a time and place. They come to me and ask for a song. I let the little ones climb my legs and get on my lap. They love to lay their heavy heads on me, and I'm happy for the weight. I tell them, the traveler could fly over an ocean in the stomach of an iron bird while their children cried or stared at a square of glass in their lap, window shade drawn while the earth rolled below, map of everything. There was jet fuel making it all happen. There were bags of crackers shaped like fish and innumerable bottles of water. The wealthy traveler ate the fish and drank the water and left the trash where they felt like leaving it. And the tired ones walked the aisle with a bag, asking for the trash. And the rich ones walked the same aisle to the tiny restroom, where they peed in a hole and pressed a button. About half the children ask only about the screen. What was on the square of glass, Big Mom? Was it cartoon animals speaking Spanish? Was it outer space? Was it secret tunnels? This really tickles me, because I know why they ask such things, and I'll tell you. My nephew, Remy Knox, one time hooked a TV VCR unit to a solar module he'd rigged on the pole barn roof, and it ran for 3 hours before it died, with the tape still stuck inside. It was a bootleg tape, the first hour and 41 minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey, followed by Ricky Tikki Tavi, dubbed in Espanol, followed by a single episode of The Last Airbender. The children do a beautiful cover of a song from the tape. Some nights they use djembe, mandolin, and uke. Some nights lute and pipa. We all breathe deep and roar on the final chorus, secret tunnel, secret tunnel. The children will talk about that tape forever. They'll get a little older and pass down the tale of the tape to the younger ones, and it will root up and bloom, and people will speak of the glowing robot screen, of monolith and mongoose, cobra and stars, and the tale of the tape will be in the blood, inherited the way people once inherited coal and caste and ceaseless trauma. Ceaseless trauma. I just have to do that, I don't know why. On Thursdays, the children trade old photographs. They call it picture swap. There's 3 or 4 boys that don't even look at the people's faces. These boys have eyes only for the vehicle in the background. Magnifying glasses are produced. It's a Cadillac, look here. Other days, they'll argue endlessly about whether or not every last bullet was really melted after the big buyback in '29. Without fail, one of them always says they heard folks were making new bullets in a smelter, and that's when I tell them, children, don't miss the fire for the smoke. How are you going to hide a blast furnace? The littlest ones love the time each evening just before fireside songs, when they go off with the older ones to look for secret tunnels and pick blackbone from the crumbling high wall at Switch Rock. A coal seam runs horizontal there in one wide stripe, and they fill their buckets up with fallen chips and walk the footpath back in a line. And when they come to toss their catch in the big pit, I look at them, waiting on the fire shoulder to shoulder with their dirty buckets, laughing, and I'm happy. Sometimes I cry because they look like the old photographs I've seen at Picture Swap, the shoulder-to-shoulder boys who always smiled when their picture was made because they'd stepped off the cage to live another day. Empty dinner bucket hooked at the elbow, carbide lamp sagged on the brow, faces black no matter their tint, pickaxe snug as a hand on the shoulder. They had coal in their blood. They had cold beer waiting and whiskey and the temporary glee of having made it back up the shaft once again. I was alive when the foreman said a mule was worth more than a man. Before that time, it was the other way around, and later it would be so again. I'm still waiting on the day when worth sees its end, the day when we can start to begin. Maybe it'll be tomorrow. I surely know it wasn't yesterday. Only thing I can remember some days is how to forget. I forget what these scars mean on the softwood arm of my high-back captain's chair. 12, 25, 38. I counted up 17 12, 25, 38s just this morning. And along the arm's slick maple edge, the word turnbuck. 17 of those, too. I don't recall carving them, but what can you do? It is our blood that remembers anyway, our blood that carries everything. Your blood is mine, and mine is yours. You stick your tongue between your front teeth when you concentrate because your great-great-great-great-grandmother stuck her tongue between her front teeth when she pinned a diaper, or arm wrestled a woodhick, or wrote a letter to her cousin, or cut a line in the dirt for dropping seeds. I will write to you, and I will sing for you too. I will do my best with what I have left. I don't rightly know myself what's a dream and what's awake anymore, but I will chase a pinhole of light to the end of every row, and if all goes dark, I'll turn around and find the light and chase it down again. I'm a mule bird, and this is my song. Thank you.
Thank you for those bracing readings. Just to dispense with a little more Portis business here, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about your first encounter with the work of Charles Portis and how it may have influenced you or inspired you.
Sure. Well, to be honest, I mean, I had read True Grit a long time ago, but, and I think you said this too in one of your pieces about him, that I didn't realize then how great it was. But about 8 years ago, my editor, Ed Park, who's also a big fan of Portis, told me about him. He taught Dog of the South at Columbia in a class he taught about humorous fiction, along with Diary of a Nobody and Turtle Diary and, you know, some other books. And he told me I had to read it. So I only read that about 8 years ago. But when I read it, I felt stunned and, you know, deeply moved and deeply connected to it. And then I went back and reread True Grit again, and I read it in a whole different way. So, and then I read Norwood, and I haven't read the other work because I like to have something to look forward to. So.
And I was also wondering why you have you don't mention Portis in the book, but you mentioned the novel. And I was wondering why Bert's ex-wife would be a fan of the book, or is it something she just wanted to saddle Bert with.
Well, in a way, Bert to me is really the key of the novel, and I guess I was identifying with Bert's wife. You know, she was a literature major. They named their dog Quixote based on a joke, a mispronunciation by a grad student of Quixote. And I used to be married to someone who was very Portisian. He was a truck driver. We took apart engines together. So I don't know. I think I just I was transferring my own feelings as the ex-wife onto Bert, and
well, Bert seems to roll with it anyway.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
And Glenn, what about you?
Well, mine's interesting because my memory's so bad, and I was such a big drinker at the time that I can't remember if I was living in Austin, Texas, or in suburban Chicago. So I was either in graduate school or I was in my first teaching job at this community college in Chicago. When I knew nothing about Portis. I mean, I'd heard of Portis, but it's not like we were studying him. And I was at either half-price books on South Lamar in Austin, or I was at a suburban Barnes & Noble. And Dog of the South was face out. So actually, Dog of the South was my first. I just bought it because I picked it up. It was one of those magical moments where no one has told you about something. You just pick it up at a bookstore. I love those times. And I immediately fell in love. And then I think I went to True Grit. And, you know, it was one of the ones where I got to the end and then went back and just started it right away again. A lot of you have probably done that. It doesn't happen very often for me, where you finish it and you're like, oh my God, I got to read that right away again. That happened with True Grit. So then I went to Norwood. And then I think I made myself, I probably was, more consistent in my reading than it was before I started having all these damn kids. But I think I did kind of the opposite of what you were saying, where you want to have something to look forward to. I did Norwood, then reread True Grit, then went Dog of the South, then Masters of Atlantis, then Gringos. And I think I've read each of them at least twice, except for Masters of Atlantis. Nothing against Masters of Atlantis, but it's a weird one to read twice, I think. And then I just couldn't get my hands on enough Portis, and I'm thinking that's how I found my way to Jay, because at some point Escape Velocity came out, and I was like, I'm getting Escape Velocity, because I had to read everything. And so that's mine, but a really quick thing that maybe kind of answers this question too. This book, I originally started writing, I think, in 2018, and it was completely different. It was called Lay Me Down in Mosestown. And it had the same characters, pretty much, and it was told by Remy Knox, whose name you heard in the passage I just read, who's a character who's probably about, like my age, my demographic, and it just wasn't working. But the way I had started that, I've become really obsessed with Gringos, and that's what we're going to be presenting about at the symposium, the final novel. Some of you have probably read it. And the opening line, of course, is Christmas Again in Yucatan. And so my failed novel that became this one, started out Jobless Again in Mosestown. So I literally was like starting books with the cadence. And I didn't bring my copy of Dog of the South with me that I found all those years ago, but I did screenshot or take a picture of one of my favorite lines from it this morning, and it is this. Because this is what I mean when I say cadence and rhythm, and I see it in Elizabeth's work, obviously I see it in Jay's, and it's just a short line about Dupree, and it says, Dupree had better watch his smart mouth too. Name your cat or dog after the prime minister in a place like this, and you would be in the jug butt pronto. And that just sings to me, We were talking last night about how I called this The Songs of Betty Bache, and my first novel was The Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart, and in retrospect, I think it's because I have a lifelong obsession with making my written word be like a song, and that the reader can maybe hear it like music. And that's how Portis's voice was to me. I love writers where I have to take a long time to learn to hear them and tune my ear to them. Cormac McCarthy, even Lucille Clifton, my all-time favorite, took a while. But with Portis, it felt so recognizable and true, and I could hear it right away, and I really appreciated that.
Great, thank you very much. Elizabeth, I did notice some, at the beginning of this novel, it reminded me of the beginning of the Dog of the South, where there's sort of a description of travel and also everything, and I think novelists don't do this often enough, really, is the conceit of the novel, or the main problem of the novel, is sort of laid out in the beginning pages. And I was wondering if that was something that you were consciously trying to emulate. I mean, William Styron said, I think he was in his first novel, was it Lie Down in Darkness? Was that his first? Anyway, that he was consciously imitating Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, with the same on a train journey, and in this case it's a train and bus journey. But was it something you kept in mind as you were writing it, or was it just something that sort of came naturally?
I don't think I was conscious of it at first. See, what happened was after I finished The Portable Veblen, I'd written a bunch of scenes involving Burt Lampe, third person, taking place in Santa Barbara. it wasn't clicking. And then during the pandemic, I was doing jigsaw puzzles for the first couple of months, and I was like, what am I doing? Like, I gotta do something where I'm really on track. And then suddenly I was on track, because I put her on the train, and then changed to first person, and it just clicked. And I never had a day where I didn't write after that. And the book went really fast. It took a little over a year, which compared to the last one, which took 7 years, was really fast for me. But I think I had internalized the structure of Dog of the South. I think that was the first book I'd read where I really understood how you could set a novel in a short period of time, but really focus on the voice and the moment, every sensation moment to moment, every texture of every uncomfortable chair, just anything. And Penny's voice came out that way, and then I began to realize, like I realized, I was like, oh, this is kind of like Dog of the South. And then when I gave it the working title Dog of the North early on, like as soon as Bert picked her up at the airport in the van, I just called it Dog of the North. And then I thought, oh, I'll have to change that later. It's, it is an affront. I was afraid people who love Portis would take it as an affront. But like by the time I finished the book, I felt like it was the right title. And I thought, this is a tribute. I'm not trying to take anything away from him or say I'm on the same level, but I love that book so much, I just can't help it. So.
Well, in Portis's a letter that he wrote to the superintendent of the Fort Smith National Historic Site that was asking him about True Grit, he said that one of the problems that he had was getting the voice right of Maddie Ross, and that he was constantly reminding people that she's an old woman telling the story of her youth. She's not a 14-year-old. It's from the perspective of an older woman. And both of these have such, they're such unique and indelible voices of real people. I was wondering what kind of problems that presented you with, how much, revision did you do? Did you check with 321-year-old people to see if you were accurate, or what writing in first person, can be, difficult, especially when you're trying to channel somebody who's not like you. So what kind of issues did you run across as you were writing?
My main issue was that I definitely come from the school of write what you know. That's how I've always been. When I was in graduate school in Texas, one of my teachers was Dagoberto Gilb, who some of you may have read before. And he was a high-rise journeyman carpenter for, I think, 15 years before he published his first book of stories, which were mainly, working-class stories and about the world that he knew. And so I kind of cut my teeth on that kind of thing. Don't appropriate. Don't write what you don't know. So first of all, I was just very uncomfortable. That was my first big issue. I had never written a book in first person, much less from the point of view of an old woman who, I'm obviously not an old woman. And so mainly I couldn't check with any 321-year-olds. So I would ask friends, like Ann Pancake is a good friend now. She's another West Virginia novelist and short story writer. And she was like, go for it. And her wife, Caitlin, was like, yeah, go for it. And then my two older sisters, I was like, what do you two think? And they're like, just do it. And so everyone was just feeling that way for some reason. But the two books that gave me, I don't want to say permission, but made me feel like maybe I could try it were, of course, True Grit, because of Maddie Ross and because of that reflection and because of that, people do not give it credence that a 14-year-old could go out and avenge her father's death. That immediate feeling that this is real and this is earned, and he had done it. He had pulled it off. That was one. And then the second book was Trampoline by Robert Gipe, in which, Gipe, he's probably about 60, and he wrote from the point of view of, a 14-year-old, again, reflecting back. And I think he felt like he could do that because of his love for True Grit. So it's not something I would have ever taken lightly. The issues that came up, I'm going to have to say not many came up once I decided to let it rip. It sounds like we had kind of the same experience where pre-COVID we had tried to write these books from a certain point of view and they weren't going well. Once I found that voice, I didn't have that many issues. Again, it was a really weird time, and I think that turned out to be fortunate for me, because I normally probably would have let my mind bog down with all of the issues. But because we were living in isolated time, and I was at home and not teaching on campus, and I was trying to dwell in the basement to get away from my family, I was able to just lock in and go, and mine was the fastest writing experience I'd ever had too, 1 year as well.
That's fascinating. Also, in both books, there is a concern with motion and travel and flight in both senses of the term, flight from something and also literal flight. And I was in my mind, I was trying to connect that to the COVID experience, since you both talked about, have mentioned that, and whether there was this sort of longing for the ability to fly or flee, and being prevented by the circumstances of the pandemic. And I was wondering if that's if you'd thought about that before, if that was a part of your work.
I hadn't thought of it before, but I think you're right. I think I was housebound, and here I was every day stepping into this other world where I was going places. And another thing that I was doing at the same time was spending time with my grandfather. There's a grandfather in the book. And his voice, all my life, he lived to be 96, and all my life we corresponded. And he was very funny. And his voice, when I read Portis, that was who I thought of. Their voices are very similar. And, I miss him a lot. And suddenly I was spending every day with him. I was on this road trip with him in Australia. They go to Australia to find her missing parents. It was a total escape. So you're right.
I think you're right too. I think, I had gotten to a place, I'm thinking it was summer of 2020, so it was not a good time, and I mean, in a way it was. I talked about this at Central, my oldest was probably 16, 17 at the time, and so, and Morgantown, West Virginia, where we live, is a good college town, and a lot of people turned out for protests that summer, on the heels of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and so that was pretty much all we would do in public. We had a rule: protest in pools. My oldest was a lifeguard at the public pool at that time, so he was allowed to go to work at the pool, and we could go to the pool because it was outside. They actually had spray painted lines on the grass next to the pool, so you would stay in your little area. And I guess I was reading, I'm like I just read up there, I'm no ornithologist, I don't know much about birds. I do have friends who are serious birders, and I always am fascinated by them. But there's this notion of birds disappearing, especially the little ones, and because of climate crisis, and we're not sure why, and that was my general sense. And as you heard the opening line, bend me your ear and I'll tell you a story about everything. It was such a strange time of isolation for me that not only do I think you're right about longing to flee and fly, but all of that was mixing together, where I was like, oh my God, we're losing the birds, and oh my God, we'll never fly again. That's what I was thinking at the time. We'll never be going in planes again. That's over. Airplane travel is over. So I was both having a cathartic experience like you just had, and a really fearful one, where I was getting very scared of the future because of all of these commingling things, the resurgence of white supremacy in this country, the climate crisis and what that might mean, the insistence on obedience to coal and big coal in my state, as you heard here, and what that's going to mean by the year 2038 for a place like West Virginia. And it all kind of stirred together, and I probably sure as hell did want to flee and just get on a plane and go to Costa Rica, where I've never been.
Well, we're happy to open up the panel for questions that you may have. If you don't mind, if you'll come to the microphones on either aisle, and whatever questions you have for Glenn or Elizabeth or me, we're happy to entertain them now.
Well, Glenn, I haven't read your book yet, so I can't ask you anything. I'm looking forward to reading it, though. But Elizabeth, I loved yours. And your writing reminded me of Portis when I got to the line where it said she's reeling off why her marriage failed, and then suddenly out of the blue it says, and he bought a mobile, a knife sharpening business? Yeah. What? And it was kind of like, you have to pay attention to catch the humor, or it just goes over your head. If you're reading along, it's that kind of humor. Anyway, I really liked it.
Well, thank you.
But I wanted to ask you, the question was, and I don't want to give anything away. If y'all haven't read her book, you should buy it. You'll like it. I don't want to give this away, so I'm going to word this in a sideways way, and you can figure out how to answer it. The grandmother had something going on. What was the connection? Had you been thinking about this particular thing that had happened that the grandmother was involved with, or what exactly pulled that in to your story? Do you know what I'm trying to say here?
I think so. I'll try to answer. There's something nasty in the woodshed at the grandmother's. But the grandmother has I think what brought it to mind was, I had a very mysterious grandmother with strange things and more than the woodshed. But she had been a doctor, and she had done research in Nagasaki after the war on atomic victims.
Your real grandmother?
My real one, yeah.
Oh, that's
yeah. She was from Tyler, Texas, and just like in the book. So that's what sort of that's what constellated into that whole situation in the book.
Okay.
Yeah, but thank you for asking.
Other questions people may have?
I'm listening to your book now, Elizabeth. I'm not going to say I identify completely with your grandmother. However, there are certain conversations or something that are a little too close to home. So
Sorry.
I'm not going to ask a question, but I am going to tell you, as I dressed this morning to come, I wore a pin in honor of your grandmother so I could stab it into anyone's thigh who got in my way. So thank you.
That's the greatest compliment I've ever gotten. Thank you. If you haven't gotten enough of my grandmother, she's also featured in my first book, Stop That Girl.
Okay, it's been probably 100 years since I read True Grit. I'm not 300 and whatever. But y'all have convinced me I've got to go back and read it again. And this is just really kind of a silly, basic question. How did you start writing? Did you set out to write novels? I mean, talk about two, what sound like on the front end, very different types of fiction. What sent you down that road to actually write and publish?
Well, I mean, if we go way back, I usually tell people that I drew first. I was always drawing as a kid. And then I was telling Jay backstage, I quit. I was pretty good when I was like 11 or 12, and then I quit. And that's why this is an illustrated book, by the way, and I did a lot of illustrations. So there's probably a drawing maybe every 5 pages or so. And that's, again, something I had never done in my previous 3 novels. But I went back to it. And as a kid, I was drawing, and then I would write stories, and so it felt natural to go back to that. But the first book I remember picking up and then wanting to write a novel, I was probably 10 years old, and my mom was working at the Huntington Museum of Art in Huntington, West Virginia, where I grew up, and they were having one of those fundraisers where they put out a huge bin with dime paperbacks, and you could pick whatever one you want. And I picked up this old paperback, and it was called Somebody Up There Likes Me by Rocky Graziano, which, of course, was a biography by, the former boxer, which they made a movie out of with Paul Newman. But I loved that book, and so I did what a lot of writers, I think, did as kids, and I started writing these bloody illustrated boxing tales where, you know, my narrator would be like, I grew up in the mean streets of Hell's Kitchen. And here I was, this kid growing up in West Virginia, you know, and so I didn't write anything that had to do with my real life at all. And you hear that so much, I feel like, particularly when people are from certain places, whether it's the American South or Appalachia. And then as you get older, you know, and I did know by the time I graduated high school, you know, I went to Ohio University pretty close by. I majored in English with a creative writing focus. I knew I wanted to write fiction. And then I, you know, had things happen like I was working at a bookstore in Huntington, great bookstore, Renaissance bookstore. It's now not there anymore, but met some really smart people there, and they told me, oh, you've got to read Pinckney Benedict. Oh, have you read Breese Pancake? And you know, Breese Pancake was, of course, dead by that time, but he grew up 10 miles from where I grew up in Milton, West Virginia, and I had never been introduced to him until I was 18, 19 years old. And so then I started getting into what we call literary fiction, and I cut my teeth on the short story, never even tried a novel, not all through college, not through graduate school. And then it was only after it was only after graduate school, living in Chicago, teaching my first job, and stealing books from my dad because he's a real history buff, and he's from Matewan, West Virginia, in Mingo County in the coal fields. And my grandma Lena, who I mentioned, was actually 12 when the Matewan Massacre happened, which was a shootout between Baldwin Felts agents hired by the coal company and striking miners. And it was very bloody and very awful, and she would never talk about it. My dad would always say, Lena, why don't you tell us about that day in May 1920, and she would not. I never was interested in West Virginia history or labor history, for that matter, until I would come home from school in Texas, my wife and I just started picking those books off the shelf. Battle of Blair Mountain by Robert Shogun, Thunder in the Mountains by Lon Savage, and I knew I wanted to write a novel about my people and their place, and that's when I got serious. So I was probably, you know, late 20s, something like that, before I ever even tried a novel. And now I've never published a book of short stories. I've published 4 novels. So, about you?
Well, I think I first wrote letters to my grandfather, as I mentioned, and we would send each other puns. So it was like I was really interested in wordplay. And if I could make him laugh, that to me was a great accomplishment. Then I think it was like in high school, you know, or a little earlier, I was reading Kurt Vonnegut and Richard Brautigan. I really loved them. I tried writing for the school paper. I tried journalism, but I just kept distorting everything, trying to make it funny, I guess. Or then in college, I started, for a while, I was into the beat poets, and I was trying to write poetry. Then one day I took, one semester I finally took a fiction class, and the teachers, it was co-taught, and they assigned books that they thought would be significant to each person individually. And they gave me Henderson the Rain King by Saul Bellow. And that's when I decided I really wanted to write fiction. And I struggled along for years trying to, get somewhere with that before I ever published a story. It took many years, so yeah. Well, thank you for asking.
Any other questions?
Thank y'all so much for this. Really interesting, and I'm grateful to hear how you each narrate the pandemic having changed the way in which you write, because I think it has changed so much for all. Living through a pandemic has changed so much for all of us that it's sort of reassuring to see that reflected. I'm wondering how both of y'all see any differences in humor in either the way in which writers are willing to write humor or the rest of us are willing to read humor after the last couple of years. Do you think we're looking for different things or reading humor differently now than we would have 4 years ago?
That's a really good one. I don't think I've thought about it too much, but my immediate instinct would be to say people are ready for it, like they want it. And, Again, it all depends on where you're from, and it's not unique to Appalachia, and it's not unique to the American South, but certainly some places that have seen better times, like where I'm from, we're kind of used to the whole smile while you're crying thing. Maybe this kind of speaks to what you're asking about. You know, we are, you know, stereotypically self-effacing and can make light of pretty serious situations in order to keep on going. And I think maybe your question about, you know, what have the last 4 years done to that, maybe they've enhanced that, but they've also made my understanding of it a little richer, in that I don't just kind of say, oh yeah, we smile while we cry in Appalachia, we're used to being beat down. And, you know, I am looking for, I'm not looking to beat around the bush anymore. I'm looking for not just laughter and providing humor and entertainment for folks, but also speaking hard truths side by side. You know, juxtapositions are something that I'm working with in this book, where I don't really care about connectivity or smooth transition anymore. I'll go straight from something that I hope will make people laugh to something that might make them cry. And I kind of like that pendulum back and forth, because I think it fits, as you were saying, how we've all kind of been living these last many years, and not just because of the pandemic, but because of the resurgence of so much bad stuff, you know, in our country. Does that make sense? A little bit, maybe.
I'm so glad that Glenn is here, because that would have taken me about 2 weeks to come up with that answer. Yeah, I don't think I can add to that. I agree.
Well, on that note, both Glenn and Elizabeth will be out here signing books, and I do hope you'll they'll be happy to sign for you, and I hope you'll take them home and laugh a lot as you read them, and also ponder things as you read them. So, but thank you again for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.